She wore her husband's boots and carried his rifle. When they asked who she was, she said, "He sent me." The desert held its breath. Sarah Hartley stood in the place where her husband's blood had turned the sand dark, watching 5 riders disappear into the heat shimmer like ghosts made of dust and malice. The Winchester felt wrong in her hands, too long, too heavy, carved for fingers thicker than hers. But she held it anyway, the way a widow holds onto the last words her husband spoke, desperate and fierce. Thomas lay behind her. She could not bring herself to look again at what they had done to him, how they had left him twisted in the dirt like discarded rope. The morning sun painted everything gold, even the blood, even the flies that had already begun their work. Beautiful and terrible, the way death always was in this place where God seemed to have forgotten his own name. His boots swallowed her feet. The leather was still warm from his body, still shaped to the arch of his step, the curve of his heel. With each movement, she felt herself disappearing into the space he had left behind, becoming something smaller and larger all at once. The spurs dragged lines in the sand like signatures she could not read. She had been tending the morning fire when they came. 5 men on horses that moved like smoke across the desert floor, their faces hidden beneath hat brims pulled low against the rising sun. They spoke in voices rough as broken glass, words about claims and deeds and things that belonged to other men now. Thomas had stood between her and them, his hand resting easy on the gun at his hip, speaking calm words that fell on ears already closed to mercy. The first shot came before she could draw breath to scream. Thomas staggered but did not fall, his own gun clearing leather in one smooth motion. The second shot found him before he could fire, spinning him sideways into the dust. The third was mercy, or maybe just completeness. The kind of finishing that left no room for doubt or miraculous recoveries. She had crouched behind the wagon, hands pressed to her mouth to hold back sounds that might bring them her way. But they paid her no mind, these men who carved up the world with lead and left widows in their wake. They took the cattle, the horses, the deed to the water rights that Thomas had fought 3 years to earn. They took his watch, his silver belt buckle, the ring that had been his father's. They left only the body and the woman who loved it, as if both held equal value in their arithmetic of greed. Now the silence stretched between her and the horizon, broken only by the whisper of wind through the scrub brush and the distant cry of something circling overhead. Buzzards, maybe, or ravens. The desert's undertakers, always punctual, always patient. They knew what she was only beginning to understand, that death was not an ending here, but a transformation. That what the desert took, it kept forever, ground down to bone and memory and stories told in saloons when the whiskey ran low. She knelt beside Thomas and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the absence where his heartbeat used to live. His skin was already cooling, drawing away from the warmth of the living world. His eyes stared up at the sky he had loved, the endless blue that had called him west from Ohio farms and factory smoke. She closed them with fingers that shook like autumn leaves. "I promise," she whispered to his still face, words that tasted like copper and salt. "I promise, Thomas." The promise took shape slowly, born from grief and fury and something darker that she had no name for. She would find these men. She would learn their names, their faces, the sound of their laughter when they divided what they had stolen. She would become whatever she needed to become to stand before them again, not as a woman cowering behind a wagon, but as something else entirely. Something they would remember in their final moments, when the desert came to collect what it was owed. She stood, her husband's boots making deep prints in the bloody sand. The rifle felt less foreign now, settling into her hands like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for her all along. She would learn to use it properly, learn to make it sing the songs that mattered in this hard country. She would wear his clothes, walk in his shadow, become the ghost of the man they had killed. The sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of amber and regret. Somewhere ahead, those 5 riders were already forgetting the man they had murdered, already spending the money his death had earned them. But the desert remembered everything, every drop of blood, every broken promise, every widow's vow spoken over cooling flesh. Sarah Hartley picked up her husband's hat and settled it on her head, the brim casting her face in shadow. She had burying to do, and learning and becoming. The men who had killed Thomas would know her face before the end, would understand that some debts could only be paid in the currency they had chosen. The desert wind picked up, scattering dust across the scene of her widowing, and Sarah began the long walk toward the woman she would have to become to make things right. Behind her, the blood on sacred ground dried black under the merciless sun, a stain that would never wash clean. The first town turned her away before she could speak. Sarah stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office in Millerville, Thomas's duster hanging loose around her shoulders like borrowed skin. The star-wearing man behind the desk looked up from his papers, took in the sight of her, woman's face beneath a man's hat, woman's voice asking about 5 riders and a dead husband, and shook his head before she finished telling her story. "Ma'am," he said, not unkind but final as a closing door, "you best head home. Ain't nothing good comes from a woman chasing after killers. Get yourself a new husband. Forget about the old one." She walked out into the street feeling smaller than she had since childhood, the Winchester dragging in the dust beside her. The townspeople watched her go with eyes that held pity and something darker, the knowledge that she was already a ghost, just too stubborn to lie down. The second town was worse. The sheriff there laughed when she described the men who had killed Thomas, slapped his knee like she had told him the finest joke. 5 men killed your husband, and you want to track them down? Lady, you couldn't track a wounded buffalo through fresh snow. But Sarah was learning that her voice was too high, too soft, too obviously female to carry the weight she needed it to bear. Learning that the way she walked, careful steps, like she was afraid of taking up too much space, marked her as prey to every wolf in human clothing. Learning that grief was a luxury she could not afford if she wanted justice. In the stable that night, alone with Thomas's horse and the ghosts of her old life, she practiced, lowered her voice until it scraped against her throat like sandpaper, walked back and forth between the stalls, trying to find the stride of a man who feared nothing, who owned the ground beneath his feet by right of birth and bullets. The boots helped. They forced her to take longer steps, to plant her feet with authority she did not feel. She rolled her shoulders forward, let the duster fall in ways that hid the curve of her hips, pulled the hat brim low until her face disappeared into shadow, until she became just another shape moving through the desert twilight. The third town sheriff actually listened. He was older, scarred by years of holding the line between order and chaos, and something in her story rang true to his experienced ears. But when she finished speaking, he shook his head with genuine regret. "I believe you, ma'am, but believing and doing are different things. These men you're chasing, if they're who I think they are, they got friends in high places. Judges who owe them favors, politicians who share their profits. You go after them alone, you'll end up deader than your husband, and nobody will remember either of their names." Sarah left that town with something harder than despair settling in her chest. Understanding. The law was a tool like any other, useful only in the hands of those strong enough to wield it. She had been thinking like a woman who believed in justice, in right and wrong, in systems that protected the innocent. But the men who killed Thomas lived in a different country entirely, one where might made right, and the only law that mattered was the one enforced by lead and steel. She began to change herself more deliberately after that. Cut her hair short with Thomas's razor, nicking her scalp in places, but persisting until she looked like a young man who had never learned proper grooming. Bound her breasts flat against her ribs with strips of cloth until breathing became an effort, and her reflection showed something closer to what she needed to become. The voice took longer. Hours spent in empty canyons, talking to echoes and stone walls, forcing her throat to produce sounds that belonged to someone else. She practiced Thomas's laugh, his way of clearing his throat, the particular rhythm he used when he was angry but trying to stay calm. She became an archaeologist of memory, digging up every gesture and expression she had ever seen him make. In a town called Bitter Creek, she tried again. This time, When she walked into the sheriff's office, she kept her hat low and her voice steady in the register she had been teaching herself to use. "Looking for information about 5 men," she said, letting the words fall heavy as coins on a bar. "Riding together. Killed a man 3 weeks back. Stole his cattle and his land deed." The sheriff looked up, studied her for a long moment. She could feel him taking in the details, the 2 big clothes, the young face, the way she held herself like she was trying to be bigger than she was. But he did not immediately dismiss her, as he would have a grieving woman. "You kin to the dead man?" he asked. Sarah felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. The truth would send her back out into the street with nothing. But the lie she needed to tell felt like swallowing glass. "Brother," she said, tasting the word like medicine. "Younger brother." Something shifted in the sheriff's eyes. Not belief, exactly, but a willingness to pretend. "Sorry for your loss, son, but I can't help you. Don't know nothing about no 5 riders." It was still a dismissal, but a different kind. The kind given to a man, even a young and clearly inexperienced one. Progress of a sort. The saloons were harder. They were places where men gathered to shed the masks they wore in daylight, where whiskey loosened tongues and brought out truths that lived in shadow. Sarah learned to nurse a single beer through entire evenings, listening to conversations that flowed around her like water around a stone. She learned to spit into the sawdust like the others did, learned to laugh at jokes that made her stomach turn, to nod along with talk of women as if she were not one herself. The Winchester stayed propped against her chair, as much a prop as a weapon, marking her as someone who belonged in this world of violence and casual cruelty. In a saloon outside Tucson, she finally heard their names. 2 men at the bar were talking about a land grab down near the border, about how easy it had been to convince a farmer to sell his water rights after his barn caught fire. They mentioned Garrett, the leader, Cole, who was quick with a gun, Martinez, who spoke Spanish to the local workers. Names that fell in her memory like stones into a deep well. "What about the other 2?" she asked, keeping her voice casual as she moved closer to the bar. The men looked at her with a mild suspicion reserved for strangers who asked too many questions. But the whiskey had made them talkative, and her youth made her seem harmless. "Burke and Sims," one of them said. "Burke's got a scar runs from his eye to his jaw. Sims, he's got hands the size of dinner plates. They all ride together when there's money to be made." Sarah nodded and bought them another round, playing the part of a young man impressed by tales of dangerous men. Inside, she was cataloging every detail, building a picture of the 5 who had killed Thomas and left her alone in the world. That night, in the room above the saloon, she stood before the cracked mirror and practiced the words that had been forming in her mind for weeks. Words that would carry the weight of her husband's memory and her own transformed identity. "He sent me," she said to her reflection, watching the way her lips moved around the lie that was becoming truth. "He sent me." Tomorrow, she would ride toward the border country where Garrett and his men were said to operate, carrying nothing but a dead man's name and a living woman's hunger for justice. The mission bell had not rung for Sunday service in 20 years, but it still marked the hours for those who needed to know when death was scheduled to arrive. Sarah heard it tolling noon as she rode up the dusty track toward the crumbling adobe walls, each bronze note falling through the desert air like a countdown to something that could not be undone. The old Spanish mission sat in a valley between redstone cliffs, its bell tower casting a shadow that pointed like a finger toward the 5 horses tied to the hitching post outside the sanctuary. She had been watching this place for 3 days, learning their patterns the way a hunter learns the habits of dangerous prey. Every second Tuesday of the month, they came here to divide their spoils and plan their next taking. Garrett, Cole, Martinez, Burke, and Sims, the 5 names that had lived in her throat like splinters since that night in the Tucson saloon. Thomas's horse picked its way carefully down the slope, as if it too understood that this was not a place for sudden movements or careless noise. The Winchester rested across her lap, its weight as familiar now as breathing. She had practiced with it every dawn for 2 months, learning to make it sing the songs that mattered in this hard country. until her shoulder bore a permanent bruise from the recoil and her hands moved to the lever action without thought. The mission looked like a wound in the landscape, its walls pocked with bullet holes and weather damage, its wooden doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Weeds grew through cracks in the stone steps where priests had once blessed the faithful. Now it blessed only the faithless, men who worshipped at altars built from other people's suffering. She dismounted at the bottom of the hill, ground-tying Thomas's horse with a whispered promise that she would return. The spurs on his boots rang against the stones as she walked, each step an announcement that she was no longer trying to hide. The duster flapped around her like black wings, catching the hot wind that rolled down from the cliffs. Inside the mission, voices carried through the broken windows, rough laughter and the clink of coins being counted. They felt safe here, protected by isolation and the knowledge that decent people feared to tread on ground so stained with violence. But Sarah was no longer decent people. She was something else entirely, something they had made when they chose to kill a good man for his water rights and cattle. She paused at the threshold, one hand on the heavy wooden door. Through the gap, she could see them gathered around what had once been the altar, using the sacred stone as a table for their unholy business. Stacks of currency and gold coins caught the light streaming through the broken roof. Land deeds and bills of sale lay scattered like fallen leaves. Garrett sat with his back to her, a big man with silver hair and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. Cole stood to his right, the gunfighter she had heard described in a dozen saloons, young, quick, and empty behind the eyes. Martinez counted money with the careful attention of a clerk, while Burke's scarred face caught shadows from the candles they had lit around their makeshift counting house. Sims, huge as a bear, stood guard by the side door. Sarah stepped into the sanctuary, her boots echoing off stone walls that had once heard prayers and now heard only the plans of killers. The sound made them look up, hands moving instinctively toward weapons before they saw her. Young, alone, apparently no threat to 5 armed men. "Help you, boy." Garrett's voice carried the easy authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. He did not stand, did not even turn fully to face her. In his world, young men appeared and disappeared like tumbleweeds, blown by winds he controlled. Sarah let the silence stretch between them, feeling the weight of this moment that she had been building toward for months. The words she had practiced in mirrors and empty canyons rose in her throat, carrying with them all the grief and fury and love she had distilled into this single purpose. "Looking for the men who killed Thomas Hartley," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady through the ruined church. 3 months ago. Took his cattle, his land deed, his life. Now Garrett turned, his pale eyes taking in the details of her appearance with the calculating attention of a predator sizing up potential prey. The others shifted slightly, hands still close to their guns but not yet committed to violence. "Don't know nobody by that name," Garrett said, but something in his voice had changed. A wariness that had not been there before. "You know him," Sarah said, taking a step closer to their altar of counted sins. "You shot him 3 times in his own front yard while his wife watched from behind a wagon. You took everything he had worked for, everything he loved." Cole's hand moved to rest on his gun, but the gesture casual but ready. "You got some proof of these accusations, boy? Or are you just here to tell stories?" Sarah felt the moment balanced on the edge of a blade, everything she had become and everything she was about to do hanging in the space between heartbeats. The Winchester felt light in her hands now, eager as a hunting hound that had caught the scent of its quarry. "I got proof," she said, and raised the rifle to her shoulder in one smooth motion that spoke of hours of practice and a purpose that would not be denied. "I got the word of a dead man who sent me to collect what you owe." The explosion of movement came like summer lightning, sudden, violent, inevitable. Cole's gun cleared leather with the speed that had made his reputation, but Sarah's first shot took him in the chest before he could fire, spinning him sideways into the broken pews. Burke reached for his weapon and found only Sarah's second shot, the bullet taking him through the throat and painting the wall behind him with arterial spray. Martinez dove for cover behind the altar, scrambling for the pistol at his belt. Sims charged like an angry bull, his massive frame filling her vision as she worked the lever action and sent a third shot into his advancing bulk. He staggered but kept coming, forcing her to put another bullet into him before he finally fell, shaking the stone floor with his collapse. Garrett had found his gun now, was bringing it to bear with the steady competence of a man who had killed before and expected to kill again. But Sarah was no longer the frightened woman who had hidden behind a wagon. She was something forged by grief and tempered by purpose, and her fifth shot took him between the eyes, dropping him across the altar where he had counted out his profits from murder. Martinez rose from behind the stone table, his pistol wavering in hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Who are you?" he whispered, staring at the young man who had just killed four armed men with the cold efficiency of a force of nature. Sarah worked the lever action one more time, the metallic sound echoing through the sudden silence like a church bell tolling the end of the world. She looked at the last of Thomas's killers through the sight of his rifle, feeling something that might have been peace settling in her chest. "He sent me," she said, and spoke the only gospel that mattered in this place where God had forgotten to look. The sixth shot echoed through the mission like a prayer finally answered, and Sarah Hartley stood alone among the bodies of the men who had made her into something she never wanted to become. The digging took her until sunset. Sarah carved 5 shallow graves into the hard earth behind the mission. Working with a rusted shovel, she found leaning against the crumbling wall. Each strike against the desert floor rang like a bell, marking time in a rhythm older than churches or prayers. The bodies lay where they had fallen inside the sanctuary, growing cold while she prepared their final resting place in ground that had already forgotten how to be sacred. She did not pray over them. There were no words in any language that could bridge the distance between mercy and what she had done, no benediction that would make peace with the blood on her hands. Instead, she worked in silence, letting the desert wind carry away the sound of metal against stone and the whispered names of the dead. The sun painted the sky in shades of copper and rust as she dragged the last body from the mission and rolled it into its grave. Garrett, the leader, went in heavy and graceless, his silver hair catching the dying light like tarnished metal. She covered them all with the same thin layer of desert soil, marking each mound with stones pulled from the mission walls. Simple monuments for men who had lived complicated lives and died simple deaths. When the work was finished, she sat on the mission steps and looked out across the valley where Thomas's grave lay 3 months behind her and 300 miles to the north. The distance felt both infinite and insignificant, measured not in miles but in the weight of promises kept and prices paid. The Winchester rested across her knees, its barrel still warm from the afternoon sun. She had cleaned it after the shooting, running an oiled cloth through the bore and wiping away the powder residue with the careful attention Thomas had taught her. A tool was only as good as the care it received, he used to say, and she had cared for this one like her life depended on it, which she supposed it had. Thomas's boots had carried her through months of transformation, from grieving widow to something harder and more dangerous. They had walked through towns that turned her away and saloons that taught her their secrets. They had stood firm while she learned to shoot, to fight, to become the kind of person who could kill 5 men in a ruined church and feel nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a job completed. But now, with the work done and the debts paid, they felt heavier than lead on her feet. Not the weight of the leather and metal, but the weight of everything they represented. The man she had loved, the woman she had been, the space between memory and revenge that she had crossed without looking back. She reached down and began to work loose the straps, her fingers stiff from the day's labor. The right boot came off first, revealing a foot pale and soft beneath the calluses she had earned. The left followed, and suddenly she was smaller, sitting in the desert evening in stockings that had been white once upon a time. The boots sat beside her on the stone step, empty now but still holding the shape of the journey they had carried her through. She touched the worn leather, feeling the places where Thomas's feet had rubbed against the sides, the impression of his heel still visible in the sole. These boots had walked him to his death and her to her vengeance, and now they were just leather and metal again, waiting for someone else to give them purpose. Sarah flexed her toes against the cooling stone, feeling the desert air move around her ankles for the first time in months. It should have felt like freedom, but instead it felt like ending. The conclusion of a story that had consumed her so completely she had forgotten there might be chapters beyond revenge. She thought about the woman she had been before Thomas died, trying to remember what had mattered to her then. The garden she had planted behind their house, the way morning light looked through the kitchen window, the sound of his voice calling her name when he came in from working the cattle. All of it felt like someone else's life now, memories viewed through glass that had been shattered and poorly mended. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and patient and indifferent to human pain. It had witnessed her transformation, had provided the stage for her husband's murder and her revenge, and would go on witnessing long after her bones joined the countless others buried in its embrace. What the desert took, it kept forever, not just bodies but the stories they carried, the love and hate and desperate need that drove people to do impossible things. A coyote called from somewhere in the darkness, gathering at the valley's edge, its voice lonely and wild. Others answered from different directions, their song weaving through the cooling air like grief made audible. Sarah listened to their desert hymn and felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of purpose that had held her together through the long months of becoming someone else. She picked up the Winchester and stood, walking barefoot to the edge of the mission grounds where the desert began in earnest. The rifle felt different in her hands now, not lighter, but somehow less essential. She had used it to write the only letter that mattered, to speak the only words that Thomas's killers would understand. Now its message had been delivered, and she was left holding an instrument with no music left to play. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky, pinpricks of light that had watched over countless stories of love and loss in this hard country. They would watch over hers too, Sarah realized, long after she decided what came next. The desert had taken Thomas, had taken the woman she used to be, had taken 5 men who thought they were beyond the reach of consequences. But it had also given her something in return, the knowledge that she was capable of surviving anything, of becoming whatever the moment required. She turned back toward the mission, toward the boots waiting on the stone steps, and the horse that would carry her toward whatever came after vengeance. The graves lay in shadow now, marked only by the pale stones she had gathered to honor the dead. Tomorrow, the wind would begin its work of erasure, scattering the evidence of what had happened here until only the desert remembered. But tonight, Sarah Hartley sat between the graves of her enemies and the memory of her husband, finally free to discover who she might become when the killing was done.